Boom, boom.
Slowest countdown ever.
Yeah, that was such a slow countdown.
They changed the layout, so I have to find where the button
Right.
is, but it's pressed now.
So you were using the countdown to buy yourself time.
Yeah, exactly. He was slow rolling to find himself to buy himself a little bit of time there. Exactly.
I see.
Recording in progress.
Classic.
Have you guys been paying attention to the fake reality? I've been paying attention to real reality, which is reading my books.
Oh, okay. And your life
the
generally.
fake reality, like politics.
Well, it was.
This week I read Althusser and Bret Easton Ellis.
Oh, nice. I've read some of his stuff.
Yeah, he wrote American Psycho, but I'm reading Glamorama.
I don't know if I read that one. I did go through a phase when I was like in my late teens, early 20s, where I read a bunch of his books. I think that might have been one I missed.
I think Bret Easton Ellis is perfect for a late teens, early 20s reader, a dilettante. You know, because it's clever. So it reminds me of a Christopher Nolan movie in that it's certainly above average for a novel.
Yeah.
But the author believes it's very far above average. And so it's too transparently trying to flaunt how deep it is when it's not.
Yeah. Did you guys see that The Onion just purchased Infowars? That's a delightful turn of events.
Really?
Whoa.
Yeah,
That's weird.
Because Alex Jones's assets were being sold at auction to pay off all his debts for pestering, for basically, what's the word I'm looking for? Just like relentlessly like making the parents of Sandy Hook survivors like miserable. So he lost like a bunch of civil trials. And so his assets are being liquidated, and The Onion purchased Infowars at auction.
So is he still going to be on it?
Is conspiracy theories.
No, I mean, I don't think so. I think like they own his studio. They own his. I mean, he could stay. I mean, he could stay on and not change anything, and it would be a satire.
I assume it's up to The Onion.
It's up to The Onion. Yeah, I think he's been on social media like all day yesterday and all day today, being like, it's the last broadcast. Like, we need your help. Like, buy our supplements. Like, and then I think he's moving to a new website just called like alexjones.com. I think he's going to have a new one.
The acquisition itself must have been a joke.
One of the funniest jokes they've ever made, like buying Infowars.
It is very meta, like using a real transaction.
And they could keep using the brand. The thing is, but they could keep using the brand, right? They could keep having articles up, keep having the same logos. And then maybe like Alex Jones's fans will get confused and they'll start like spreading like onion stories that are actually like Infowars stories, that are actually
they
satire.
could have fun with it. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. If I hadn't heard that, but we could have done that this week instead, because the fake news that fell off because the real news got so fake then buys the fake real news to make it fake.
That is true. They are in the same market, literally. Just one's
no, but Infowars pretends to be real though. Like The Onion doesn't really do that. I mean, I actually like my hot take about satirical news. I think consistently the Beaverton, which is the Canadian version, is actually funnier than The Onion. I find often, but this is a great joke. I gotta say, this is one of the best things they've ever done. Kudos to them for one of the best trolls ever.
Yeah, I understand your meaning, but could we question the meaning for a second? Because you said first of all that Infowars pretends to be real and The Onion does not. And yeah, we know what that means, but still, formally they do the same thing. It's just that one audience believes it and the other audience laughs at it, isn't it?
Good stuff.
But then you also say this is a great joke that they bought Infowars. But is that a joke? Because they truly did buy it. They truly did exchange money and now own it.
Yeah.
Now, all this is worth thinking about, but it's also, segue here, why I picked the author this week who went by Louis Althusser, because among other things, he offers some ways to analyze belief. Why do we believe what we end up believing in the first place? And does our intention have anything really to do with what we end up believing? Have you ever taken like a symbolic logic course or just an analytic philosophy course on belief?
I did. I took a class on beliefs in analytic philosophy.
So did you cover, I think it's the dominant model over there in epistemology, but it's to claim to have knowledge of something is to have three elements, which is a justified, true, belief. And I don't know who exactly spelled that out, but it's attributed to Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, that like early 20th century crap. The cat is on the mat.
It's mid to late. I mean, there's obviously like a lot of internal debate about that, but yes.
And then there's Gettier cases that mess up with that. But I am really dissatisfied with that definition of belief because it just means giving a mental assent towards something. And then last week when we brought up this thing about wrestling, there's something weird about that where you give mental assent to something while also knowing that it's false, but every one of your actions would indicate that you believe that it's true. And that is kind of, to preview here, Althusser's definition of what ideology is. But isn't that what watching Alex Jones is like? You have to assume that not every single viewer...
I think a lot, not every single viewer, but I think a lot actually believe it.
Well, what is actually...
I'm not saying 100%, but I'm saying like probably like 70% of the people who watch him regularly, I think believe it.
See, I'm not sure about that because I wonder what they would say if you got them on the couch. Because with ideology in the psychoanalytic context here, the addition here is that a central part of believing is also desiring. And that is at least in part unconscious, but not completely cut off from, analysis, even your own reflection. Because I know that I'm willing to suspend judgment more for shit that I prefer. So I just got to assume that others somehow know that they are suspending judgment on what they want to hear. Don't you think?
No, you're I think you're projecting your like well-educated elitist bias on the general public. I don't think that they know that. I think they are mindless automatons, many of them, who just get pulled and pushed by things that flatter their insights and things that make them be like, oh yeah, like he is after truth. Like he is trying to like the deep state. Like, no, like I think you're giving the public way too much credit.
I can't tell if you're trolling right now.
I think he is trolling.
I'm not trolling.
You're trolling.
Oh,
back to Christopher Nolan. It's like watching Christopher Nolan because it like hints at a kind of intellectualism, but you also know that you're smarter than it because it's stupid intellectualism. So you get a certain pleasure out of enjoying like Interstellar because of how stupid it is.
Oh, Interstellar is such a bad movie. I hate that fucking movie. I hate I hate it. Like, I hate the ending so much. Like the thing about like love transcending like dimensions. God, that ruined the whole movie for me. I literally was just talking about it, and a couple of my friends were saying how much they loved that movie, and I had to take a big shit on them. I had to be like, that movie fucking sucks.
Don't be like that. You can also love it because it falls flat, like Inception. Firstly, Inception's very cool looking. It's also risky for a Hollywood film it's normally just pablum. But there is an insight in there into psychic structures. Like the more you're more likely to believe a belief if you believe that it arose spontaneously from deep inside you. But if you go down deep inside yourself, then it's just an abyss.
Oh, dreams within dreams.
Well, I was going to say that this definition of ideology that you're mentioning, it's worth noting that I think that's basically how Zizek uses it too, right? Like I think he uses like an Althusserian style or similar.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but that whole justified true belief analytical tradition is not really based on action, though. I mean, what we describe as science is supposed to be like, well, in one definition, it's just like a collection of truths. If you believe these things, then you have true beliefs about the world, but it has nothing to do with action. Ideally, I guess you base your action on your beliefs, and your beliefs being true means your actions are great.
That is a question in analytic philosophy about they call it action theory. And they talk about the connection between,
as opposed to mental state. Theory,
like in
whatever
pragmatism and I guess probably behaviorism too, like your actions are what sort of show your belief. Not just, it's not based on like your thought process, what your like mental representation corresponds to reality or not. There's the other way. Yeah, I guess action theory would try to like fill in that gap from the analytic side. And then the other side is like, what's going on in that black box of the mind?
Yeah.
All right, so we have a few things that we just dropped in here, and it all fits into the stew. But if we can start to disentangle it.
Yep.
I was thinking when I read this, like, Zizek, when he's writing, does say Althusserian things about ideology, but then when he says like pumpkin spice latte is pure ideology because there's no like, Althusser specifically says ideology is not something like advertising, and it's not a ruling class conspiracy. Starbucks does not do ideology, and the body snatchers from They Live don't do the ideology. It's not thought control. It's not mind control, because it's spontaneous. Like there's no class or people or puppet masters that are outside of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The one wielding it is as much a victim of it as the one whom it is being wielded over, I guess.
But Zizek doesn't think that you can get out of ideology, I don't think. I think
no, he doesn't.
I'm just trying to clear that up before we get started, because otherwise we're going to be way off on the wrong foot. But B, I'm not up on the Zizek hot take machine, but did he not say that Starbucks does ideology and that They Live is a brilliant film? Put on the glasses.
Oh, the glasses going on and off. Put on the glasses and you see the real message behind the advertising.
Well, he says you actually should take off. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's true. It's true. There might be some kind of a contradiction there. I feel like I don't know the depths of his work too much, but I know.
He has this line about it being like, it's in the ideology is in the transition between taking off and putting on the glasses. Like it's not literally on one side or the other of the lenses. It's the kind of the lens effect itself.
Oh, I don't know. That sounds... Look, I stand to be corrected. I'm fine if I'm wrong, but I didn't watch that for today. I read Althusser first.
Well, you said something, Pills, though, that sounded very Zizekian to me about like when people like don't really believe something, but they still continue to behave as if they do. And that's something that I feel like Zizek talks about all the time. Like he has that whole joke about the horseshoe.
Yeah, the Copenhagen joke with Niels Bohr, I think.
Yeah, Niels Bohr about like the horseshoe at the front, keeping away bad spirits. And
the salesman pitches it that way. He says,
he's like, well, you don't believe it,
works
do you?
even if you don't believe in it.
Exactly.
So this man of science, Niels Bohr, can go, oh, well, if it works, even if I don't believe in it, then I'll fucking buy one, of course, and puts it up. Then his friend asks him about it, and he says, well, I got this guarantee. I don't believe in it, but that's how it works.
Yeah,
there's an example. The best example in this text that demonstrates that your belief or knowledge about it is spurious, though, is money. Like you can be a Marxist or whatever and see through money and say, well, money is just a reification of social relations. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. Yet it doesn't fucking matter if you realize that. You still have to pay your rent. You can't just show up at your landlord's house with a barrel of hay and be like, here, this is my rent for the month. Like whether or not you recognize ideology qua ideology makes no difference to the way that you are compelled to function to live. So it's not even necessarily a negative thing. It's just what you're born into and stuck with.
Yeah, it's like knowledge of the truth of it doesn't abolish it in a way. In a way, it's like part of the truth is this fictional part of the truth is part of the truth.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense to me. I do love his toilet thing, though, right? His toilet, Zizek's toilet is like my favorite discussion of his of ideology, right? Have you guys actually gone to Europe and seen these various other kinds of toilets?
Oh, yeah. The ones where your like shit runs down the side of it and down to this little dribble of water miles.
Well, it's the German/Swiss one, I think, that has a little platform that's dry where like when you shit, it just like sits there displayed. And like apparently Germans have this tradition of looking at their shit for health reasons. And it's like, and they'll have some explanation. They'll be like, well, isn't it natural to look at your shit to make sure that like you're not sick? And then it's like, and then the French one just has like one hole at the back so that it like disappears right away. It's like gone. And then the Anglo-Saxon American toilet has water. So it kind of like floats there. And Zizek's like, well, of course, that's pragmatic. It keeps your bowl clean. And then it's like, the English, it's like economy and like pragmatism and efficiency. It's like, well, it's clean. And then it's like Germans are like philosophers and poets. So they like want to think about their shit and look at their shit. And then the French are like revolutionary. So they're like, get rid of shit right away. Liquidated. It's gone right away. It disappears.
Oh my God. Yeah, that says a lot about our different cultures.
And they all have like different rationalizations, right? Like they won't say it that way, but the French would be like, well, why would you want your shit around? It's gross. Like, let's have it disappear right away. And then the English will have a story about like why it's good to just have it float there. It keeps the bowl clean. It does get rid of the smell. And then the Germans are like, well, how are you? You need to make sure that you're healthy. It's like shit is like a big indicator of like how your health is. It's like you should want to examine it and look at it.
That's true. That's probably the smartest one.
Yeah, maybe.
You face your shit directly.
Exactly.
Don't hide your shit, man. You could be sick. All right. Bring it back to ideology.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Okay. Well, what that example says to me, apropos ideology, is that there's always a justification that you read backwards into the real in order to explain it and why things are the way they are. And it appears that the justification for why the thing is the way it is primary, when it's actually kind of arbitrary and could be otherwise.
I mean, as cultural differences, the way you treat your shit is just what it is. What it is. There's no best way.
Well, it's just like
those methods. Probably
it's like an example of something that's like every day that like in that society they don't really question, and then when you ask them for a reason, they have some rationalization for it. But it's like, I don't know. I think Zizek would say, but that's just like in some ideology, but it's just like,
that's
it's not really
the rationale that you give for whatever your belief, your cultural belief, that rationality is, I mean, that rationalization must be part of, you could see that as part of the ideological story. You think I do this because it's just makes sense. This is the way it's done. And only there are you deep within ideology, not free of it.
It's almost always used in a negative bent, but pretty much Althusser came up with the definition that Zizek uses, and pretty much this is what we're looking at today.
Well, yeah, very, very exciting.
He incorporates psychoanalysis with Marxism. It's basically how he brings all this stuff together. But anyway, I've been like reading this while there's other stuff going on in the world that I didn't pay attention to at all. Thank God. This was so relieving. It felt like returning to reality, and we're returning to like the core of our podcast of critical theory and philosophy, because this was very much both of those things.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, this is pretty core to at least Pill's and my sort of, I mean, Althusser's theory of ideology is very deep into the culture studies, humanities kind of area, I guess you could say. Because, after the 60s, right, Marxism was revived. And the Anglophone world knows it through probably the New Left in Britain that developed during the 70s, and the New Left Review, and people like Stuart Hall and Raymond Williams and Richard Hogarth, and those British Marxists of the 70s of the New Left, which were heavily influenced by a number of figures, revisionist Marxists, I guess you could call them, or like sort of third or fourth wave Marxists. I don't know, starting with like Walter Benjamin and the broader Frankfurt School, but also Antonio Gramsci and his prison notebooks. And then Althusser is another huge major figure that influenced them, especially his definition of ideology and cultural Marxism, the real kind from the Birmingham School, not the weird kinds that Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay talk about. Don't know what they're talking about. Cultural materialism would probably be a better name to distinguish it from whatever batshit they're talking about.
A lot of who we tend to address on this channel, they, for a lot of reasons, didn't like Althusser. He became black sheeped a little bit because he was uncompromisingly in support of the French Communist Party. He was a party man, and even when people like Rancière and Badiou and Guattari wanted to break with the party, he said, no, it's party or nothing. And they got kind of mad.
And he also went insane and killed his wife as well. Just thought it's worth mentioning that as well.
Well, let's qualify insane.
He had mental health issues.
Yeah, he was depressed to the point of hallucinating, psychotic depression, I guess, which sounds pretty bad. He was not criminally charged. He got sent to a mental asylum, but apparently he didn't know that he was killing her, and apparently he also wrote that she wanted to die. They were both super depressed. It's kind of it's a very tragic story. But that was in
Wow.
what was that, 1979? And we're reading 60s today.
I know I've heard this used against him as part of that reaction. Be like, well, didn't he kill his wife? Like, why would you read his shit? It's like, well, it's not like he joined the Nazi party or anything.
Well, because I mean, you know my stance on that. I would never say, you shouldn't read someone, but it's still obviously like an important biographical detail. The man murdered his wife.
It's interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not sure after the death of the author we can read that too much into his work.
Well, I never would have read that kind of stuff like myself. You know me. I'm just like, is the idea useful and interesting? I don't really care that much about what the person. I mean, we read Schmidt before. It's interesting. It's wrong, but it's interesting.
Well, we looked at his earlier stuff too. He did keep producing things up. I think he died in 1990. So his later work is well regarded too, I've heard, but I'm not familiar with it. It's more like the philosophy of the encounter stuff is more like later Althusser.
How much later after what we read was the stuff about interpolation and like the ideological state apparatus?
It was at the same time.
I think that's all part of this.
That's all 60s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like apparently, because I said he's like a big party guy, right? And we know the French Communist Party was in charge from like the 60s to the 70s, and then the libs took over in the 70s, and that weirdly coincides with when he and his wife got super depressed and never left their house. So it could be a little bit of that causation, but it is at least correlation.
So we're blaming the libs taking over for him murdering his wife. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah. The libs are at the bottom of most bad things that happen.
Like most things that happen, it is the libs' fault ultimately.
Well, to be fair to the party Communist Français, I mean, for most intellectuals, I think of the time, at least from the 50s and 60s, it was like your entire social life too. Like to quit that party, you don't just like quit the party or leave the party. Like you have to basically break away from your entire social clique. Like people I'm sure they met their partners there, and they did all their outings based on it. Like it was your entire life. It wasn't just a little thing to like join and leave that party. If you got kicked out, that was like your whole social life done. You got to build from scratch. That would suck.
And this is another notable thing about him. I don't think we have a single like monograph of his. Basically, all of his books, like this book, for example, is For Marx, but it's like 8 essays. And most of the essays, or I don't know if most, a bunch of the essays were first published in the Communist Party journal. So it's kind of surprising that he's so well regarded, because he didn't write a monograph. He didn't write the book called Ideology. It's just like these short essays, including the most famous one, which is Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, which is not what we read today.
But which first appeared in his Lenin book.
That's the text I definitely know better, although it's been a while since I read it.
That's the one you read in every intro class.
Yeah, exactly.
ISAs.
I mean, any class that's doing like Marxist theory, it's going to probably talk about that. Like, unless it's just a Marx class, but if you're doing kind of like a broader critical theory, Marxist theory, it's probably going to be in there.
Well, we were saying too, this is remarkably clear writing for coming out of a time when French theory is stereotyped as being impenetrable, but this was a little bit before, I get, to be fair, the whole post-structuralist, postmodernist French theory moment. But you still do have very difficult and influential writers like Henri Lefebvre and Jean-Paul Sartre. And I guess the Situationists and Guy Debord, they were active at this time, and they were a factor in the May 68 student and worker protests. Althusser was apparently sick during that time, but he was influential as well.
Yeah, they were at post 68, but they were like the teachers of the 68 generation. So Lacan too.
Yes, and we have Lacanian psychoanalysis and Lacan, famously impenetrable.
Yeah, he's a huge fan of Lacan.
Oh, is he?
And a contemporary. You could sum it up to say this. If you took Lacanian psychoanalysis and mixed it with, I think, what we now call structural Marxism, I don't think he did, but if he thinks that we could have a super science, a theory of everything, if we had Marxism plus Lacanianism, because Lacan's only drawback is that he doesn't recognize historical materialism, and historical materialism doesn't really know what to do with the subject. So if we combine those two, we could have a super theory of history and society. And ideology is his main contribution.
Excellent. Some have pursued it, and he has definitely written on the relationship between Marxism and psychoanalysis. And according to Gabriel Rockhill, that's the part that the global theory industry is promoted most heavily.
Okay, whatever.
The writings that have the least to do with Marxism.
Let's get the fuck out of here with that. And I'll just jump straight into the massive claim here, because he thinks the left, Marxists, everyone needs to do away with something called Marxist humanism. Marxist humanism is the problem for Marxism. It's standing in the way. And his claim is that Marx, there's an early Marx, late Marx, 1845. 1845 is the year that Marx published two texts, the Theses on Feuerbach and the German Ideology. And for Althusser, this is a massive break. I'll overstate the point a little bit, but everything prior to 1845, including the 1844 manuscripts, just throw it all out. We don't need it. It's tainted. It's tainted with humanism and Hegelianism and psychologism. Everything that you need from Marx and historical materialism is found after 1845, and especially in Capital. So we're splitting it right down the middle. Marx fixed it on his own. He doesn't need us to fix it for him, but we need to stop doing the disservice of reading any humanist bullshit into Marxism, because it's screwing it all up.
So could you define humanism,
so much
or one of you?
Complicated shit there. But yeah, no, we'll get to it all.
Hey, I said I was going to overstate the point. If you do want to walk it back,
no problem. No, it's difficult. I mean, the 1844 manuscripts that a lot of those humanist readings of Marx are based on, as I've said a million times, I'm sure by now, were published in 1930. So people didn't have access to them until a couple generations after Marx. I'm not even entirely sure where the main texts of early Marx's influence would have come from to form this humanism, at least before the 30s.
Could we define like humanism? Could we say a bit more about what that means for Althusser?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to that because it is my position.
Mm-hmm.
And I was ready for that question. So humanism's not so much like a philosophy school as it is a method. And it's a method that defines Western philosophy in the modern period specifically. And it's not restricted to philosophy like as a discipline. You can do humanist theology, humanist history, humanist economics, all these things Althusser brings up. And right, modern period. So it's usually mapped to the Renaissance in like literature, I guess. And usually like Descartes in philosophy. But in the method, the human being has a bunch of presumptions attached to it, usually religious in origin, either like the moral soul or the rational mind that participates in God in some way. And this human being becomes like the building block of the theory to explain the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. So humans are different in kind then. It's a hangover of Christianity, that humans are different in kind from the rest of creation. They're not different in degree, like a lot of people might believe today, but they're like unique in substance, probably because God put it there, or it arose spontaneously as reason. But in any case, like having reason there in history, in the universe. Now there's a little area of moral purpose, of purposiveness, or teleology, you might say. We're not here by accident. We're here by design. And it might be God's design, or it might be this happy accident that we discovered rationality on its way to truth. But it allows us now, like history has a purpose, and we have to figure out the best possible way to live. We have to figure out the best possible state and the best possible society. And we can do this as humans to take control of nature and bring history into the real world, or the best society or best economy. We can figure it out in theory and bring it down here. And the universe has a moral direction, you can say. Now, no animal's going to do that. Planets aren't going to change their orbit, but humans are special because we're a difference in kind, not just in degree. So for Althusser, conversely, history is not explained best by human beings making rational decisions or by a moral order to history. It's better explained, conversely, by or at a higher degree of complexity, like society, which is what Marx tried to lay out and succeeded in Althusser's mind. So you don't look at a single individual and explain why it's behaving like it does, but you have to look at the individual in a system, in a society, in an economy, blah, 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 blah. And then if you figure out the relations of production, this is far more explanatory than trying to organize a system of individuals. So systems, then, society, explains how history works, not individuals. So the history of philosophy, by and large, thinks, well, to explain the economy, I have to start down here with how colors work and appear to my eyes, with like Locke and the empiricists. Or Descartes saying, well, the most important thing I have to figure out before I can do anything else is if I'm dreaming up my chair or not. But the inversion here, the materialist inversion, is to say, we don't start with human consciousness. That's not the basis of the theory. Marxist Descartes, on the other hand, would not be asking if the chair in his room is real. Marxist Descartes would first ask the question about what long network of labor relations transformed what used to be a tree in the forest into an object of contemplation for someone with enough leisure time on his hands to ask if the thing is real or not. So in the theory of history, it's a completely different starting place. There's humanism versus post-humanism or anti-humanism.
Right. Okay. That's helpful. I think the way that I was reading it was like a slightly stronger claim. I think that I was reading that I found myself very skeptical of, which was that which is maybe it's not inconsistent with what you're saying, but I think a more radical break from the involvement of human beings, that it's like all you need to know about is the economy, and that like any theories of like human nature or human behavior are kind of unnecessary because they're ideological in this way. And like really what we need is this science of Marxism. I don't know if that's different, if that's inconsistent with what Pills said. But I think where my skepticism came in is like, well, if that's the claim, you still need a theory of like how the human is affected by these structures, right? So like you can't just like erase, you can't like just totally reduce everything down to economy unless you understand that the human is going to react to those economic forces in a consistent way. Otherwise, it's not a science too. Also, that's another thing that I'm like, this kind of use of the word science. It's like it needs to be predictable. It needs to be sort of something that we can rely on. And so therefore, if we have something that we can rely on that is predictive of how humans are going to react to these economic forces, then there is like a kind of covertly snuck in story about human beings, about how they're subject to these forces. So like that to me doesn't seem like it's really getting rid of the human. I mean, you can try to do kind of it kind of reminded me a little bit of the way that sometimes scientists, like, I don't know, like evolutionary biologists, or I don't know, like there's certain scientific stories that try to give like a purely objective account of human behavior that kind of does a scientific reductionism that I've always been skeptical of. And I don't know, like I worried that there can be some versions of this sort of economic It's like a left-wing version of like scientific reductionism, except it's like Marxist scientific reductionism, where it's like, we don't need to know. And I guess, maybe this is also just my own uh sort of like starting point of phenomenology, that I'm like, well, there has to be something included in the story about the human. So I don't know, that was my reaction.
Well, he says people are still going to believe in themselves as individuals and act as if they are doing everything by their own will, right? That's not going to change. It's just that you cannot explain what has happened in history as though it were a moral development or a change in people's attitudes all of a sudden. It is first and foremost a change in the relations of production that causes big shifts or big wars or things like that.
Yeah, that's why I find that part appealing.
Okay.
Yeah, like humanism here becomes just like one ideology among others, like religion and ethics and philosophy itself are all.
But is Marxist science not also ideological in a similar way?
Well, no. See, according to Althusser, socialism becomes scientific in Marx's hands after the 1845 break, right? That's where the break between the young and the later Marx is, according to Althusser. And, well, how is described in like part 3 of this essay, his break, from the early humanism, right? And then he describes how Marx realizes that humanism is not a theoretical concept, but a practical concept. So there is real humanism in the world. People call themselves humanists and they devise humanist philosophies all the time. You can't deny it. It's obvious. Yet you can't make the problematic of human nature, which is what humanism represents, is this problematic of human nature. What is human nature? Remember when we read the 1844 manuscripts and you sort of asked, well, what would like a production system that's in line with human nature? What would an unalienated, system of production be like? Well, that is precisely the problematic of human nature that Marx abandons. He's no longer going to ask that question. What is in line with human nature? In a sense, there is no human nature. The human nature is to have no real sort of nature.
But then how does Marxist science have any predictive power? There's no human nature, because like you need an account. Like if the economy is gonna cause,
history becomes the broad
force. That just seems like avoiding because you can't like there's no predictive power if you can't say that like the economic forces are going to impact human beings in a predictive way. Like, so like even when we were talking about the election, right, we were kind of giving a bit of a materialist analysis of it, that like the working class farm, but implicit in that is that people care about like the material conditions. That's an account of human nature. Like that's a story about human beings. That's still a story about human beings.
Human nature is a very broad categorical description of modern philosophy. It's Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Ricardo, Kant, Feuerbach are the ones that he mentions. And he says human nature is assumed as like the cornerstone, the beginning point to explain phenomenology, or what we now call phenomenology, also political systems, also all economic systems, also ethics. Each of these begins with a human and then goes up to God, or goes up to economy, or goes up to society and Leviathan, or whatever it is. We have this building block. So to say that people follow their self-interest, this is not a claim about human nature. This is a functional claim about one part of a system. If I say that plants will turn light into energy, I'm not making a claim about plant nature. I'm saying a function about.
Yes, you are. How are you not? How are you not?
That's a function of what a plant does. So
okay, so you're saying there's a distinction between function. Okay, so it's just calling something, because like my understanding is of like, when I think about human nature, I just think, okay, like it's a description of how this thing functions. It's nature, right? So like a human being functions in accordance with its interests, right? That's a story to me about human nature. I don't really, but if we want, we can just be like, fine, that's different. So I guess I'm not following this distinction between function and nature.
Dude, just think for a sec. I know you've read all the same shit that I have. This is nature in the history of philosophy. Like the concept of nature, not the English word, the way that we might use it in a sentence. When a Catholic philosopher talks about human nature, he's reading Aristotle's Politics. He's not talking about what people tend to do sometimes. To follow nature is to recognize that the universe or God is ordered, and there's clues as to how it should be ordered by making men political and by making women nurturing. So like as soon as you invoke nature, there's also obedience to the natural order, which is supposed to be carried out. And if you're in an ordered universe with a moral duty, then that is to serve the office or the station in which you're born. Whereas if you're an enlightened modern, the truest nature of humanity is to be rational, maybe. To the extent that something is non-rational, then it's also non-human. And then you can go to someone else, Rousseau. For Rousseau, the truest identification with human nature is to be free. Thus, you owe humans freedom, but only insofar as you recognize them as such. So nature's prescriptive, function is descriptive. Not as the English word, as I just said, but as an ideological concept.
Yeah, I was going to say conflating like nature and function is kind of, if you're conflating nature and function together, I was going to say you got to separate those things a little bit. Like if I said, what is a knife? And you said, it cuts bread, I'd be like, I didn't ask what it does. I asked what it is. Like there's definitely a difference between nature of something, of its essence, and like a function, what it does in the world. Or even like, he talks about existence and essence and the difference between those two things, right? In humanism, you give a description of a human, right? Human nature, what is it? It's language, it's reason, it's freedom, it's all these things. And then like that whole essence is then contained in each existing individual, right? And so
so I think
that's
like
the humanist
I get what you're saying. Like, so I think there's just two. So to respond to kind of the two things that Pill said, the first one about like the order of the story, like that, like you start with like kind of a macro perspective of these economic forces, these cultural forces, like that makes, whereas like other views in philosophy sort of started with kind of meditating on like, what is this teleology of the human being, and then build up. I've got no problem with that. Like, that's fine. Like that makes sense to me. I could understand kind of a different order of analysis. And then, okay, then the second part is like this conflation between function and nature. I guess like maybe I'm using the word nature in sort of a more modern scientific way, like the way that like science, like in the sense that like you use the example of the plant, like, okay, its function, like to me, when I say like the nature of the plant, like it's genetics created it to be this kind of being that happens to have photosynthesis. That's part of the plant's nature. But I guess we want to make a distinction, which it's funny, like you said, I'm playing word games. It's funny, like when I was reading this, I was like, this just feels like wordplay to me. It's just like wanting to divide. Because when I think of nature, like I just think the things like function, like the thing that it does predictably. It's like it pursues like, and there's still, and in another way of putting that is like, there's an implicit story there about the human being that it's going to do these things, which to me is like, okay, the story is its interests, right? And I think, in a way, it's a different order. So you start at the macro and then you try to claim, oh, we don't even need to talk about the human. But I guess my sort of frustration sometimes when I'm reading this sort of materialist determinism, like that kind of proudly like proclaims under the banner of like, no need to talk about the human. I'm like, yeah, but there's still a story there about like the way the human is going to react to these forces. That fine. I guess it's its function. You guys want to call it its function, and other people, I mean, admittedly, there might just be like a divergence of the way to use it. But to me, it's like, but there's, as long as there's a story there that you need for the theory to make sense, it's still a story about, at least from my perspective, human nature, but fine, we can call it function. So I don't know if there's a disagreement here about like the actual facts of this account. Maybe it's just a kind of disagreement over words.
I mean, it might be, maybe we can like explain via our example, one of his examples.
Mm-hmm.
One thing we talked about with respect to the election is that there are measurable, that's to say objective, maybe even scientific relations that cause people to become politically radicalized with respect to the existing status quo, right? Like if there's a big political swing to the right, this indicates not a change in ideology. It indicates a change in the relations of production or social relations. You agreed with me on that on last week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a change in ideology too, obviously. But the best explanation for that is always going to be that there's been an objective change in social relations, which is, like this case, inflation as one indicator, not the best one, but also, years of stagnant wages, bleak future prospects, next generation has less buying power than the last one did. Now, these are real conditions, and they're the same for most people, and yet there's not one political expression of those conditions. There are many. And the ideology comes into play in unpredictable ways. So through ideology, your lack of having control over your life, or lack of having agency, or being whatever the fuck they're all talking about, a young man in America who has no future, blah, blah, blah. But those real conditions, despite being more or less the same, they can be expressed in an indefinite number of ways, just like with the toilets. The toilet, there's the 3 toilets. The ideology comes afterwards to justify why it couldn't have been any other way.
Yeah.
So it could be, I'm not actually poor, I just haven't got lucky yet. Or it could be, I'm not actually poor, it's just that the immigrants stole my job. Or it could be, I actually do have control over my life if I could just get these woke bureaucrats out of my country so I wouldn't have to see them on TV anymore, then I could feel like I want to feel. So the reality, we set aside that explanation. But then how that reality is lived out, that's far less determined. So I think ideology might have the answer to all the stuff that you're having problems with. Because he says the Marxism deals with the science part. And the reason he spends his career on the ideology part is probably because Marx didn't do a good enough job over there.
Okay, that does help. And I think I agree with all of that. I think, there might be a broader, what's kind of, as we could say, maybe a specter in the background here is like previous episodes, I think that you and Eric did about like humanism and like being anti-humanism. I don't know if they apply exactly to this situation, but I know that that's like a little bit in the background for me. But then so in the foreground of my mind is like, I think for like, setting aside this specific case of using humanism and anti-humanism, I think I've always just been a skeptic of views that try to say, oh, like we don't need to talk about the human at all. Okay, like so now the way you've explained it, there's like a level of analysis where you can just talk about the material conditions that is like the science. I still think that like there's still a kind of implicit snuck in story that like the reason those material conditions matter is because the human will or can react to it in a specific way. Now, on the ideology front, again, I would say like, yeah, I agree with that 100%. Maybe you're not going to disagree with this, but I'm like, the fact that like the reason I find Lacan, Merleau-Ponty, others so useful is because like they're giving me a rich story of like the way the human functions, like the way it reacts to things. It is subject. It is the type of thing that will become taken up by ideology under various conditions. So like, I think I just like think it's weird to try to make these broad claims that like, we don't need to talk about the human. We're leaving that behind. It's like, well, I think, and then we give a story and then I'm listening and I'm like, yeah, but that's still about humans. Like that's still about like how they react to these sources.
But ideology, the humanist explanation doesn't explain causation, which is the thing that you want to know. Let's do the test case. Let's do the test case right now. Looking at humans gives you the wrong answer. Like 50% of the news last week is, why are men now so chauvinist and racist all of a sudden? Answer, they are racist and chauvinist because they are looking at racist and chauvinist podcasters. If you are looking at ideology, an 18-year-old who says, I am a Maoist, and an 18-year-old who becomes a Nazi, ideologically, they appear to be opposites, right? But causally, scientifically, they aren't opposites. They are the same expression. They both see no hope in the direction of the current social relations. They see no tangible future for themselves. That's why they swing. So just because you prefer the humanist explanation doesn't mean the humanist explanation is a better one or more explanatory. In fact, it's obfuscating.
then there might be a conflation that I'm hearing from you guys that like, oh, humanism is just the type of thing that is like a type of account that is like maybe overly normative and teleological or something.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So whereas for me, I'd be like, I think like I would be with you, and I'd be like, yeah, there's many types of humanisms, most humanisms that were like overly normative, overly teleological that I disagree with as well. But like where I object is like this sort of self-congratulatory like gesture to be like, well, we're just getting rid of humanism. I'm like, no, you're just telling a better, more accurate story about humans. Like that's what I think.
Well, yeah.
He also brings up three different types of humanisms. There's rational humanism, liberal humanism, and communalist humanism. And young Marx starts as a communal humanist and then breaks with it.
So I got that. It was interesting.
He starts as a rational liberal humanist. Second stage, he's a communalist humanism, and then he breaks with it.
I would like to clarify this. I don't even care if we spend the rest of the episode on this because we can get the rest of it dealt with next week or do a couple on this. But another way to see this is humanism is sort of the ideology of proto-capitalism. The Middle Ages are not humanist. People kind of say like the beginning of humanism is in the Renaissance, which is not necessarily as feudal as the rest of Europe. But if you read someone like Aristotle on man, he's certainly not a humanist. He's like a naturist or a naturalist in some sense, where this cosmic force called physis is like defining what everything does, and humans are just one aspect. Humans are like bees, basically, gregarious animals. So I know that you're objecting to like I care about the humans in the story, but what would you say about like Aristotle's philosophy not being a humanist philosophy, even though it includes humans, of course?
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree with the like. It depends. Yeah, I think I would have a similar objection. I would just be like, you can't get rid of it. Like the question of the human, you can't escape it. Like that's, I think, my kind of perspective. It's there. It's in the background.
Well, yeah, and we are humans, and ultimately, language and our species and all, etc.
Look, I think I understand. I think it's about a demarcation of like these categories, that there's just like a difference here, maybe. I just think that, and I don't want to like, I know you said you're happy to talk about this for the rest of the podcast, but I don't necessarily want to derail it. Like, I think in my head, I understand it. I think maybe you guys understand the demarcation difference. I disagree with this other way of demarcating it myself. Like, I think
if you don't get it,
adds to confusion.
Listeners might not get it. So I want everyone to get it.
No, I think I get it. I think I get it.
Humanism doesn't just mean humans are there. It means humans are central and they're bestowed with some external expression that is contained through every human. It's almost like it's a magical explanation of what humanity is. Whereas what humans do, you don't need any magic to explain that.
I agree with that.
Okay, something like that.
Well, we should also.
I agree with that, of course. I mean, I think it's just when you're telling like we're humans, we're always we can't escape the human perspective, since all the writing, everything is from a human perspective. It's impossible to escape it.
Well, yeah. I think we should look at what Althusser has to say about it.
Because he's also going to say that there are sciences that do escape the human perspective. Like when we're doing physics or the Copernican revolution. These are ways of escaping the human perspective.
Well, sure, but you can't.
The process of scientific knowledge specifically over history is also the process of challenging or putting into question long-held human intuitions that are supposed to explain whatever they purport to explain. And Marx did this with history for him.
Yeah, I get that.
He's not saying that there is no humans or they're not worth talking about. What he's specifically saying is humanism is ideological. Whatever different types of humanism is ideological, and it is not scientific, right? The concept of the human is banished forthwith from 1845 from any theoretical pretensions. We cannot base our theoretical conclusions on a concept of the human. but there will still be the human very centrally in there, because ultimately communism is about social relations between human beings, and a society is a collection of social relations. But it eliminates the theoretical pretension. It breaks with the idea of philosophical anthropology or humanism, right?
Yeah, I get that.
Science puts that aside. Science leaves ideology and humanism, religion, ethics, all those things to the realm of politics and practice. And then we can circle back and actually look at what Althusser, what else he's doing in this sort of article too,
Look,
which I think would be helpful, and we'll go back over those questions, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with that explanation. I just think it's really, I don't know if it's just like a rhetorical disagreement or something. Like, I get that there's a difference in that kind of, like, I don't know, modernist sort of account of humanism that is like highly morally charged and kind of gives it a certain kind of normative priority that is like at the center of everything. Like, I get that. I think, and then, okay, this scientific approach, this scientific perspective doesn't want to talk about human nature anymore because that's too tied up with that kind of overly moral priority account of the human at the center of everything. But instead, it's going to talk about broader systems and then kind of the function. And then the human is just like a thing that has that is like a function of the system, or it's, well, reciprocal, you know, whatever. I agree with that. It's just like, to me, when I say there's still a story about the function of the human, and I think really it's just like, and I still think of that as a story about human nature. It's fine that like other people don't, or other people want to make a distinction there, but to me it's like the function of the human in that system is still a story about human nature. You guys can call it function, that's fine.
Okay, you don't like it? Here, another familiar example is the humanist telling of history. One example of it is the great man theory of history. They give you a story.
I get that.
It tells you what happened, but it also gives you a terrible explanation. Why did World War II happen? Well, it's because there was a man named Hitler. Hitler was particularly evil in his heart, and then a lot of people died. That's basically what I learned in social studies. Nothing about the German and American industrialists supporting him because he promised he would ban trade unions. Nothing about hyperinflation because of the Treaty of Versailles. No, just Hitler is uniquely evil individual. Just mind-controlled a country. Or that the wars of religion were really about religious differences, or that the war on terror was really about terror. But then you just go, obviously, nah. The human nature explanation, an ideological explanation, they're always epiphenomenal, and thus they're bad explanations.
Yeah, and I think one important thing to know is that he's responding to a historical development that he sees, which is this first line: socialist humanism is on the agenda again, right? So what happened? Stalin died in 1953, and a couple of years later at the 20th Congress, Khrushchev gave that secret speech, what is called the secret speech, where he denounced, first of all, the cult of personality, and he sort of laid out a new direction for the Soviet Union. So this is really, a lot of these articles are in that context of rethinking sort of the way forward from the Stalinist era. And Althusser is one of the leaders in that. And that's, this article sees people sort of going back to the era of Marx's humanism, Marx's earlier texts from 1844 and earlier, to sort of give this rebirth of Marxist humanism. That's why this article is Marxism and Humanism. And why bringing them together, I thought, is a lot like what they're doing with MAGA communism, right? There's a theoretical unevenness there as well, right? The same sort of thing Althusser is talking about in part 2 here. You know, MAGA is an ideology, and communism, or MAGA socialism there is supposed to be a science, according to Marx and Althusser and others. And so there's a sort of theoretical unevenness. He says that, you know, the concept of humanism is no more than an ideological one that is representative of the early Marx. So there's a sort of conceptual distinction here that also parallels a historical development of Marx's own thinking.
And the reason that those things are being brought together, I don't know if you mentioned this, but the reason that they're debating it is because the USSR, and specifically Stalinism in the USSR, is being criticized for being like not personally free like the West is. Because Western humanism, like French humanism at this time, is very concerned with personal freedom. And there's a very specific local definition about what entails personal freedom. I think it's probably more or less our definition, which is, freedom of speech, assembly, marry, religion, all of that stuff. And then the French people in the PCF are looking at Stalinism and going, no, this was morally bad because they didn't have personal freedom there. And this is his complaint about conflating socialism with humanism, because they only had 40 years in the USSR to even get this far. And we're judging the movement of history in moral humanist terms. And he can say, yes, according to our humanist ideology, they are behind. But he's also kind of defending it, saying this is also not the only kind of freedom, because the dictatorship of the proletariat is supposed to be building this kind of freedom that will hopefully be produced in the future.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good point. So at the center here should be class struggle, class antagonism, right? And the idea is to eliminate class antagonism. The bourgeois reject the whole idea of class and don't look at society at all through the lens of classes. So you have two classlessnesses. And what happens in the absence of class humanism, you end up with a humanism of the persons. Yeah, so a socialist personal humanism, like the word persons becomes important in both frameworks again, just as Pills was saying. So yeah, you do have this danger of socialist humanism almost like becoming too close to bourgeois humanism.
Well, he says that straight up. He's like, who is that? Khrushchev? Khrushchev is using all these terms to criticize Stalin quietly, but he's just doing it to like get the liberals off his back.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, I don't know. There's a rhetorical strategy there, but yeah, I guess Althusser sees it as almost like a right-wing conservative kind of reaction.
Oh no, it's a little late in the episode to start a was the USSR really that bad discussion again?
No, that's as far as I want to go. That's just the historical context that Althusser is writing in. I don't want to say anything about the actual history.
And that context also matters because what Althusser is saying here is liberal humanism specifically is going to have one story. It's how we started like scratching out a living by killing deer and living in villages and how we got to us. And then they're going to look at something like the Soviet Union or China in the 60s and go, look at how like barbaric these people are compared to us. We must be more civilized because we are more moral people. Whereas Althusser is saying, well, they're working on something else. They're working on class freedom, which is something that we don't even have in Western liberal democracy, in large part because it's something that we cannot even conceive. It's not part of the ideology. Our ideology is individualist humanism, personal freedom, personal humanism.
So is he basically saying, like, from what I'm hearing is it's really a project of kind of anti-moralism about politics and change in society. It's like, so, like, it seems to me that, this mention of humanism is a placeholder for a kind of moralist explanation for
yeah, maybe
change.
the moralizing of the bourgeois.
Right.
Yeah, the history of the bourgeoisie is whatever led to us is good. And before we came around, it was war and chaos and darkness, and now you are all free. You have to spend all your time working? You don't make enough to live a life? Well, don't worry about that because you are free in your mind. You can say whatever you want with all your freedom.
Right.
Yeah,
and then,
yeah. You'll have normativity
yeah.
in communism as well. You'll have ideology and normativity in communism as well, but it won't be the kind, hopefully, that, is based on class exploitation like that.
Sure. And and I think I heard you say something, yeah, like bourgeois ideology will maybe, yeah, they'll have this myth about you being free, which kind of hides the conditions of your, your slavery or whatever. And that makes sense to me. And then, so would we have said that in like previous societies, like feudal societies, would the ideology have been some kind of, hierarchical ideology that like, a working person, or is that just like a period where
I think you would call their ideology something like duty. Because, right,
yeah,
if you buy Althusser, no one's causing ideology. It just kind of spontaneously arises so that everyone believes in it. So if you're a serf, you have a duty to your lord. Your lord asks you for this much hay, you do it. If you're a lord, you have a duty to your people. Like if someone's threatening then you have to defend them. You have to get on your horse because you're going to go defend your poor little peasants. And even all the way up to the king. If you're a king, you have a duty to God, which puts you, politically speaking, somehow even with or below the church. So even it's not like one person receives all the benefits from ideology. It's like it's throughout the system.
I get it.
Everyone believes it.
What I was going to say is, in a way, it's really like almost a reaction to like a reaction and rationalization of the material conditions in a way that's like that kind of happens spontaneously, right? So it's like,
yeah.
If we can just round this out nicely, we'll go back to the toilet thing. Like everyone has a reason for why their toilet's the best, but ultimately they're all just toilets.
Yeah, right. And then the story with the serfs, it's like, well, it's your duty, but it's, the material conditions are well, I mean, they are what they are. It's like these powerful, and then like there's a story about why. I guess the one last thing, although I want to be, maybe we should make this a two-parter. I'm not sure if this is going to open up another can of worms, but I think my other like thing that kind of bothers me is this use of the term science. And I understand that, it's probably, well, I don't know, I guess when Althusser was writing this, but certainly when Marx was writing, right? I mean, maybe our understanding of science was a bit different. But I guess, I was thinking about this. It's like it's opposite, like science versus ideology. And then I guess I was thinking about like the social sciences today and how people are like critical. For example, economics, right? It's like economics is pretending, especially classical and neoclassical economics, right, is giving a story that like it claims to be scientific, right? It says, but then a lot of people rightly, I think, criticize it and say, no, but like underneath that mathematical equation, the way that you calculate inputs and outputs and expected behavior is based on all kinds of assumptions that I would maybe call ideological, right? It's like about the way the human being is expected to react in certain situations, a kind of individualism as well, right? There's a kind of individualist assumption, but they still call it and I guess I'm just wondering, like, how is this Marxist one? Like, it's kind of a similar story in a way as economics or other social sciences. But it's also, I think, again, going back to my point about humanism, based on certain kinds of assumptions, which we might just think are right. But like, like, I guess, how are we to know, when is something really a science? Because it's, I think like based on the definition that Eric, you outlined earlier, that's from Althusser about the difference between ideology and science. I was thinking when you were talking, I was like, well, a lot of these social sciences are still doing the same thing that would fit under Althusser's definition of science. But then the problem is that there's assumptions built into it, right? There's assumptions built into the calculus that are potentially ideological. And I just don't know that I don't think that it's unreasonable to wonder whether or not like a Marxist science is also built on assumptions that could be ideological.
I'm sure it is. And I know that he has a definition and a working theory of science, but I can't remember what it is. I just know that he's written on it somewhere. But I think with respect to Marx, Marx founded the science. He's not going to get it right on the first try. Just like Freud did not get psychoanalysis right on the first try. He still discovered the object of psychoanalysis, which is the unconscious. And Marx didn't discover history, but Marx was the first to wrest history out of ideology, out of these bad explanations, and give it new concepts.
Reproducibility or replicability, predictability.
Yeah, concepts that can be used more universally, which is the purpose of science. So I think science still got ideology in it, but it can be improved, probably not perfectly, because that sounds like another ideology.
Yeah.
The way that Althusser says, like, ideology is not going to go away, no matter how scientific we get. It's, the most flagrant ideology to think that science will replace, ideology or religion or ethics or anything else. Ideology is not going to go away. It's a constitutive part of society in the history of societies in general. Every society has its ideological constituents, apparatuses, whatever. But I think, remember, Marx wants to effect a scientific revolution within one of the sciences. That's the point of Capital, right? It's a critique of political economy. And political economy is the science that it's a broader area than either economics or political science today. It's a more integrated science of society and its histories, right? So he wants to effect a scientific revolution, just like a Copernican style revolution in physics and all the other physics revolutions, but in economics, political economy. So, for instance, Marx is always getting very angry about the ways that, people like, I don't know the specific references, Petty or John Stuart Mill or whoever writes on political economy will make statements about this or that economic principle, and it's eternal because it's rooted in the nature of man, right? It is man's nature to exchange things. Therefore, this is the way it has always been. And if it hasn't always been this way, then things just haven't been ideal, right? And that's what always pisses Marx off, is naturalizations of historical concepts, like concepts that are historically specific to the capitalist mode of production. Marx goes after those. It's a critique of political economy. He's sort of trying to effect a kind of scientific revolution, as it's regarded as a science, within the science of political economy, and put it on more, stable or more precise and accurate and historical footing, you could say. That's my sort of best answer. You just keep in mind the specificity of Marx's project as well in that regard.
Well, on one hand, I do find saying the ideas don't really matter. Don't look to rhetorical interests. Don't look for statements of belief, but rather look to who owns what and who's around the people that own what. This is probably going to give you a good explanation of most political phenomena a lot of the time. But I'm also with Victor on this question. Like, is this kind of insight the thing that we now declare a science? I think at least next week we should check out what Althusser's specific definition of that means. Because a local insight that provides explanatory value, I don't know, maybe does that a science make?
I remember even being in seminars or maybe like at the bar with a bunch of Marxists, and I remember them like kind of proudly and a bit like indignantly proclaiming that Marxism is a science and that you're just not getting it, man.
Well, Marx regarded himself as a scientist, as a social scientist, and famously said, je ne suis pas marxiste, I am not a Marxist, when he was confronted by his son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, about what some of the French quote-unquote Marxists were doing. He famously said, I'm not a Marxist, and famously said he wasn't looking for a Marxist system. He wasn't looking to create his Marxist system. And he didn't want a huge monument over his grave. He wanted a very simple gravestone stuff. He was already against that cult of personality stuff anyway. But he was also regarded himself as a scientist. And he was trying to effect a scientific revolution. So I don't know. Marxism is not in itself a science, I guess. And if you're a Marxist, you can read non-Marxists who are also scientists.
He has a claim with Durkheim and Weber to also having invented sociology. So insofar as you view sociology as a science, maybe it's a soft science. I mean, fair. But he kind of invented that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he's regarded as a founder. Yes, a very different kind of founder, but yeah, he wanted to revolutionize at least political economy from within, but through a critique of the main concepts they use. And yeah, I guess science, like, Marx engaged with actual natural science of his day too. So presumably he had a good idea of what empirical investigation and theoretical generalization and all the ins and outs of those sorts of things.
Well, I think, like Victor said, it's actually us compared to most of humans most of the time that have an idiosyncratic view of what science is. And it comes out when we divide hard science versus soft science versus speculative science. Like we are the ones that have the narrow view of it. Knowledge.
It's not really just like the knowledge that's stored up. It's people, it's groups of people investigating questions. It's a living endeavor.
I think we're at time. We kind of only got to 3 pages of this, so maybe we can maybe we'll deal with ideology specifically in the next episode.
Oh yeah, there's some banger definitions he gives in part 4.
Contrary to the way we use ideology, he just straight up says there's no way to get out of this. Even if you live in a classless society, even if we had perfect utopian communism on Earth, you would still need ideology. It's not advertising and it's not PR. PR and advertising, they're just like lies, and lies that's kind of easy to do. If you're fooled by PR and advertising, you don't have a chance. If you willfully believe in unreality, then you're a wrestling fan, and I appreciate that. Well, we'll put a pin in it until next time. We come back to ideology and try to go in more detail into what that specifically means. So, till then,
Yep.
Thank you, guys. It's a hard reading.
Thank you.
Okay.
It was good, though.
Goodbye.
Peace.